PAX. How you doing? That's not bad. One more time with feeling. How are you doing? It is Thursday and you are at PAX. I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty awesome. Let me introduce myself. My name is Aaron Suduko. I am the founder and chief video game analyst with The Terrible Fate. Any of you guys heard of us before? Okay, yeah, that's pretty good. We're very small, so it's okay if you haven't. We're an online publication that's dedicated just to analyzing and trying to better understand and appreciate the storytelling of video games. That's all we do. I'm here with my friends and colleagues, Jaron R.M. Johnson and CJ Thomas, to talk about a series of articles on the site that they're working on called Hero of Time. More generally, what we're going to be thinking about is fan fiction, the many uses of fan fiction, and how it may even be possible that by taking a certain approach to fan fiction, you can end up illuminating and better understanding the source material in fiction that inspired that work in the first place. So a roadmap of what we're going to be doing here. I'm going to be talking with you for a little bit just about what fan fiction is, some reasons why you might do it, and why the kind of fan fiction that we're working on the site has a kind of function that, while not necessarily novel for fan fiction, I think is definitely underappreciated in the common discourse about fan fiction these days. After that, Jaron and CJ are going to be diving in and talking to you about the process that they went through as they tried to construct a Zelda fan fiction. And then we're going to leave some time at the end for questions, hopefully starting out in this room, and then afterwards, if you want to keep talking to us, we'll be hanging out outside. But we got to start with a very easy question. What is fan fiction? Because if we are going to be talking about this, we should have at least, a fair understanding about it going into it, right? So before we get into any kind of definition, I think it's fair to say that it's a very personal thing, fan fiction, right? Personal confession for me, I actually, as I started planning for this panel, I thought, oh man, how am I going to talk about fan fiction? Because I don't write fan fiction. That's not really something that I gravitate towards. And then I thought about it a little more, and it occurred to me, actually, I grew up with a hell of a lot of Legos. And Legos are just fuel for all sorts of fan fiction. For me, it were Bionicles. Has anyone heard of Bionicles before? Played with some Bionicles? All right. More than have heard of us. That's good. And so it occurred to me, and I actually was able to dig up some of my old, OC for Bionicles, because I loved those stories, I loved the comics that Lego put out, and I actually ended up creating my own. And I think that's kind of a common experience, that even if some of us tend to outgrow fan fiction in some sense, it's a very natural urge to exercise your imagination, at least as you're a child growing up, engaging with stories and falling in love with stories. More formally, since we need some language to be able to talk about this, right, we're going to be talking about fan fiction as a story that an author has created using characters, timelines, or settings from someone else's work of fiction. And that other work of fiction is going to be called the source fiction, right? So if you want an example that you might be familiar with, Alphys from Undertale is very interested in fan fiction. Within the realm of the game, Undertale is also an apt example because besides discussing fan fiction inside of the game, there's so much fan fiction about Undertale. So that's going to get our discussion off the ground. Now that we have a sense of what fan fiction is, why would we create it, right? I think that, like Alphys and Undertale, right, there's this strand of society that thinks fan fiction is something that you only do if you're sort of a pariah or if you're on the outskirts of normalcy. And I think that's just not true. So in order to get into an understanding of why we might be doing fan fiction, it's important to parse out how it can actually be motivated by some very natural impulses, right? If you're a writer or someone who likes to create things, existing fictions can be an awesome writing prompt, right? Or on the other hand, if you're really interested in a story, but you don't really like that one aspect of its plot, you can write a fan fiction that rectifies that, right? And gives you the story in the way that you wished it had gone. Just so if the author doesn't end up going into a lot of detail about something that you really loved, like, it's a fantasy novel and they mention elves, but they don't really go into the lore. You can take to fan fiction to flesh out that aspect that really interested you. And of course, if you are personally connected to a story, what better way to enrich that connection than to write yourself into it? I don't think any of this is very othering. I think these are natural desires that we can all kind of relate to, right? But the focus of this, and on actually better understanding the source material that fan fiction comes from, is sort of this fifth bucket of reasons why we might write fan fiction, which is to actually try to understand and better analyze a source text. This is what we're going to be focusing on with this panel, and it's what CJ and Jaron focus on in their series, Hero of Time. So we're going to call this, just as a matter of distinction, analytical fan fiction. And the key thing to note here is that it's geared towards providing everyone with a new understanding of its source fiction. So if you go back to that list I had quickly, right? As I said, these are all pretty natural impulses, but if you look at the first four, like I said at the outset, they're pretty deeply personal, right? And they're personal in the sense that oftentimes, if you look at someone else's fan fiction, you can recognize this definitely has personal meaning to you, and it might have helped you enrich your own relationship with the source fiction. But as an outsider, I'm not really going to get a lot from it, right? So the idea behind this fifth thing, analytical fan fiction, is to say that actually by thinking about it in relation to better understanding the source fiction, we can share it with anyone. They don't have to have written it, and they can share in that enhanced and enriched understanding of the source material just as much as the writers themselves can. It's easy to say that, but how could you actually do that, right? It seems like a tall order to just pick up a pen, start writing, and somehow create a work of fan fiction that lets you see the source fiction differently, right? I think a really interesting use case for this kind of analytical fan fiction, as the one that CJ and Jaren focus on, is the notion of when you have a fictional series and you're trying to fill in a gap in the series, all right? So as an example that's near and dear to my heart, Dishonored got a sequel, I think just last year at this point, time flies. And it picks up later on in the story, a decent chunk of time after the events of the first game. So there's a logical gap in the series, right? We know as people who have played the series that time had to pass and things had to happen in between the end of Dishonored 1 and the start of Dishonored 2. The question is, what happened? How can we understand that? How can we ultimately, hopefully, better understand both Dishonored and Dishonored 2 by getting a better understanding of what had to happen in the interim, and maybe even writing something about it? And that's the interesting thing, because I think the natural impulse for a lot of us when we see that kind of gap is to say, well, we won't know what happened in that gap until the author of the source fiction releases a story telling us what happened there. So if you're interested in Dishonored, you might be waiting on your hands for Arcane Studios to release something kind of explaining that gap. But the idea behind analytic fan fiction is to say, well, actually, maybe we don't have to wait for an official story. An official new release from the developers might tell us what they're saying happens in that gap, but actually by turning our attention to just the existing content that we already have in the form of the entries in the series like Dishonored 1 and Dishonored 2, we can actually infer a lot of things about what has to have happened in that gap, and that can serve as the basis for crafting our own work of fan fiction to fill that gap. What are the tools that analytic fan fiction has to actually do this, right? I think the most obvious one that probably comes to your mind first is just, the matter of events in a series. So if you know about the events that happened in a certain game, and then something happened in a gap, and then you have more events, it can be a matter of logic to figure out that there are certain things that have to have happened after the first game in order for the second game to logically follow, right? More interesting, you can also look to themes of the series, right? So, of course, as video games tell stories, right, they're also able to, represent pretty elaborate themes. But also, series of games are able to represent themes that arc over multiple entries in the series, right? So think of trilogies, right? A trilogy is a very natural way of structuring a series of stories that reaches beyond any given one and actually gives you a broader thematic arc. Think of the original 3 Star Wars movies or something like this, right? So if you notice a thematic gap in the series, that can be just as telling as a gap that's simply in events. To go back to our example of Dishonored, to illuminate this for you, just to point out one way that we could think about this, right? So in the first Dishonored, right, Corvo, your avatar, has the job, amongst other things, of protecting and hopefully saving this little girl princess, Emily Caldwin. Jump to the events of Dishonored 2. Emily has gone from being a little girl to being the Empress, a bit older and a bit more established in that role, even though she's still growing into it, right? So if we're thinking about these two tools that analytic fan fiction has, if we're trying to write a story about that gap, we can say, well, one thing that we know has to happen is Emily has to grow up, right? Which means that, in fact, she can't die in the first game, which is something that is possible for her to do. Also, thematically, right, if we have this overarching theme of Emily kind of growing into her own and coming to be an actual effective ruler versus the impressionable child whom we see in the first game, We might say that there's a thematic gap where we actually, see what happens to Emily that forces her to have a coming of age where she's able to grow into that role. So already we've identified two kinds of gaps that an analytical fan fiction story could fill and actually end up teaching us more about the series. There's a third tool, I think, that analytical fan fiction has at its disposal when we're talking uniquely about video games, and that's about the experience of the player. Obviously, it's easy to say, oh, video games are interactive, that has a big influence on their story, yada, yada, yada. But I think there's actually a specific and really interesting way where if you're thinking about a series of video game stories, right, and that series is intended to draw in the same players over time, we can actually say that there's a certain onus on the series to grow up or mature, or at least change over time in a way that reflects the players changing over time. So let me give you a little brief toy argument to that conclusion. Basically, I'm going to make two pretty obvious observations, I think, about gaming and just the way that we are as people. And then we're going to see that from that, it follows that series need to develop in some way with the people who are playing them. Here's the first observation, right? If you think about the choices available to you in a game, right, it had better be the case that those choices, in some aspect, reflect choices that you would actually make in real life, right? If the choices that your avatar is able to make are just so bizarre and outlandish that the player would never even conceive of them, it's not clear how the player would be able to either A, identify that that's a choice that's available to them in the first place, or B, even if they are able to literally identify that choice, make any sense of how it contributes to the broader themes and broader economy of the game's story, right? So I think in some way, the avatar choices need to be responsive to what the players see as choices. Here's another observation that I think is, again, pretty obvious. As we grow up and as we go through the world, what we see as available choices to us changes over time. Think of a kid, right, 6 or 7 years old, and the way that they plan for their day and maybe their week. They have no concept of long-term planning, right? If you ask a 7-year-old, where do you see yourself in 5 years, right? Either the 7-year-old is gonna just kind of look at you quizzically or say something predictably ridiculous. Like, of course, that's not going to be the case that you're an astronaut in 5 years, 7-year-old. But I don't know, maybe Elon Musk will prove me wrong on that one. But as the 7-year-old grows up and becomes, say, someone in his or her mid-20s, they have a concept of long-term planning. They're able to make decisions that reach years into the future. Even if they're pretty bad at that kind of long-term planning, they have a concept of it, right? So as we grow up and as we learn to see the world and our place in it differently, we see different choices as available to ourselves, right? But here's the conclusion that we can draw now. If it's the case that video games should be reflecting the choices we see as available to ourselves, and also that the choices we see as available to ourselves change as we grow up, if a series is trying to draw back the same people, especially if they're initially children when they're first drawn into the series, it had better be the case that subsequent entries in that series, just in virtue of this argument, actually change what's available to the player to reflect their changed view on the world and the choices they see as available to themselves. And so if that's not the case in a series, that's another kind of gap that we can look to and try to fill with this kind of analytical fan fiction. And that's exactly the kind of gap Jaren and CJ and I think that we see in the Legend of Zelda series, which is where I'm going to turn it over to them to pivot from this more broad theory stuff to talk about how they went about building a work of fan fiction in this style with the Zelda series to fill in probably the most commonly pointed to gap in the Zelda series. So with that, guys, I'm going to turn it over to you.
What is up, PAX East? How are we doing on this Thursday? First Thursday. How many of you guys, is this your first PAX? Awesome, me too. So that's pretty dope, actually. I'm a little nervous, I don't know if you can tell. I just wanted to thank you guys for coming out. I know for a lot of you, this panel was probably addressed with a lot of skepticism. Can fan fiction really be this valuable? I'm stoked that you guys are here. I hope that we can convince you of that. We'll go ahead and start into what we're gonna talk about here today. We're going to be talking about specifically whether or not fan fiction can be used to teach us anything about The Legend of Zelda. We'll start by talking about some general fan fiction stuff, kind of set a base ground of understanding. We'll talk about how and why we began writing this Hero of Time story that we've been talking about. And then we'll start talking about some of the specifics, what can it teach us about the fans, about the developers, and about the games. And then finally, we'll kind of tie all of that back into why Hero of Time is the way it is and why we chose to approach it in the ways that we did. Before we get too far into it, I want to let you guys know we're not going to be standing up here and just pitching you our fan fiction, so don't expect to get a bunch of the story pieces from it. I know that's not why you're here. It's mostly going to be talking about the analytical aspects. So, to introduce ourselves, right? My name is Jaron R.M. Johnson. I'm a writer and analyst for With a Terrible Fate. I love Wes Anderson films, and I write fan fiction.
Hi, Jaron.
Thanks, man.
Hello, PAX. I'm CJ. I am also an analyst for With a Terrible Fate, and I write fan fiction.
Hi, Colin. Thanks, man. So, who here in this crowd loves The Legend of Zelda? It's good, great, awesome, cool. Who here in this crowd loves fan fiction as much as they love Legend of Zelda? That's less people. That's way less people.
This guy gets it.
This guy gets it, though. That's what's up.
There's a good reason for that, too. Fan fiction is, as Aaron said, deeply personal. And part of it being deeply personal is that fan fiction can be written by anybody. And that can mean that it can be very good, and that can be something else sometimes.
Yeah, we've actually seen a lot of that, haven't we?
Yes.
I'm trying to think of some few. I think we've seen some really bad Harry Potter fan fiction. What are you thinking about here?
We've seen some bad Sonic fan fiction.
Oh, there was some bad Sonic fan fiction, wasn't there? Do you have any other ones, man?
Super Smash Brothers.
Oh, there was a Super Smash Brothers fan fiction.
Yes.
And then, and this is my favorite, there was this other fan fiction. I don't know if you guys know. It was originally a Twilight fan fiction, and it got adapted into a movie.
No, we're not doing that.
I made slides.
I told you we weren't doing
I made
that.
a lot of slides.
I told you we weren't doing that.
All right, we'll skip through some of these then, I guess.
No,
If we're
keep going.
No, I'll keep going. It's fine. There's a lot of good stuff. There's some really good stuff. Okay, fine. No, we'll just keep going. We'll keep going. All right.
I'll never forgive you.
Hey, man, I'll never forgive you. That's good content, okay? Well, fine, okay. So barring that amazing example that we've just skipped over, what if I went ahead and told you guys that fan fiction can be way better than movie adaptations? What if it could be, this awesome tool that we can use to better understand a series and a way to kind of like explain some of our own perceptions to other people? I feel pretty strongly that this is the case. I know CJ and Aaron both do too. And we're pretty stoked thinking that hopefully by the end of this presentation, we'll convince you guys as well.
So to kick off our fan fiction steeped conversation, I have a terrible confession to make about my opinions of the Legend of Zelda series. And that is that I don't like Skyward Sword. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I know I'm allowed
You're
to be
bad.
wrong. I'm allowed to be wrong. It's my right, I think. But I didn't like it. It was not my favorite game, and personally, when it came out, I thought the Legend of Zelda series was dead, like really dead, like good Star Wars games dead, just dead.
That is a
I'm
lot
sorry,
of
I'm working through some things. And this eventually led me to set out on kind of a little hypothetical quest of mine when I was a young burgeoning writer.
You're so cute then. What happened?
I know. Which was I wanted to write the perfect Zelda sequel. That's what I really wanted. And I think it was back then. It was because I wanted to know that it was possible. And it was because I didn't know it was possible at the time. Not to say that what we've got up here is perfect. That's not what I'm trying to say.
That slide was perfect.
Huh?
That slide was perfect.
That slide was perfect. It was beautiful. So Jaron and I got with Jaron here, we set out to create this hypothetical sequel. And over passing the point back and forth over a few years, we eventually did come up with our own very shameful fan fiction about Legend of Zelda. Not something that I intended to just be a written story that I would post on Reddit or something like that, but I wanted a game. I wanted to write like a full game, front to back, and that was back when I was young and stupid.
As opposed to old and stupid. No, we wrote the original version of this story, which has been years ago now. We kind of filled it with a lot of these contradictory hopes and dreams for kind of what we wanted. We wanted to have a game that sort of took us back into our childhood. The first Zelda game that we played, which, as I'm sure for a lot of you guys here in this crowd, Ocarina of Time, right? A lot of us wanted to recapture some of the game moments that we had playing that because it was really valuable to us. But not only did we want to kind of, go back in time and kind of relive that childhood, which, as we'll talk about later, is a little unrealistic, we also wanted this game to sort of take the series into the future. We wanted a way to kind of like look at the direction that it's going and maybe just overcorrect the steering just a little bit. What's cool is, thanks to Aaron, we've had an opportunity to start telling this story and to refine the ideas that we use in this story on the website with A Terrible Fate. We've been running this article series, Hero of Time, where we're doing a lot of what we're doing right now, which is just kind of walking you guys through some of the decisions that we made and some of the ways that we approach these tactics. I am super stoked about this opportunity. It's obviously brought me here to you guys. You guys think I'm hilarious, right? Yes? So that's awesome, I think, for all of us. Rude. So writing it gave us a better understanding of the series as a whole, which is really, really valuable to us. But not only did it give us a better understanding of the series as a whole, it gave us a better understanding of kind of what we expected out of the series, what was and wasn't realistic. It also gave us a heightened understanding of kind of the large fan base that it has and some of the really interesting aspects of that fan base. And we're really stoked to share some of the stuff that we've learned here.
So part of our understanding comes from writing fan fiction. Part of it also comes from reading fan fiction, and to give us these kind of generalizations that we can make about the fans or the developers. So fan fiction can teach us about the fans of a series. Take the Sonic fan base.
Please take.
That's not what I meant. In the Sonic fan base, creating original characters is a really popular trend nowadays. And again, that's something that anybody can do, so the quality can range up and down, and sometimes it can come out a little bit special.
Sometimes it's amazing. Have you guys seen this? Don't take any photos, by the way. This is an original character. I would hate it if you guys stole it. You can see the copyright down there. No photos.
But this popular trend is something in which when you play a Sonic fan game, if you've made your own original character, and then I'm not saying that we haven't done this, Jaren, but when you play a Sonic game, your perception of that game is colored by your own original character, whether you realize it or not. Maybe you're in a slow part of the game, and what you begin to do in your head is create a little side story for yourself. And when enough people do have these colored perceptions of the game, it's never truly concrete, but it may eventually become worth acknowledging to the developers who eventually recently released the game Sonic Forces. I forgot the name of that game for a minute. Sonic Forces, which allows you to create your own characters, such as Cold Steel.
Cold Steel. Yeah, it's important to note that, for the fans that write this fan fiction, we're not saying that, everyone who creates a Sonic OC, myself withstanding here, has this expectation, right, that their character really exists in the canon. That's a little unrealistic. I think a lot of people understand that, that's not the case. But that OC, that original character, does exist somewhere in their mind. And as they play these games, as they move through these series, that little itch is in the back of their head saying, well, what would Cold Steel be doing right now? What would he do to react to this situation? How would the situation be different if Cold Steel were there to save the day? And I think that expectation is, like Colin said, occasionally worth acknowledging to the developers.
Just to bounce off that real quick, I think even for developers who more or less claim not to listen to their fans, Nintendo, that your opinions as fans, our opinions as fans, I guess I'm a fan too, they matter. Whether or not they want to acknowledge them or not, our opinions will eventually color the perceptions of the developers who make these games. So just keep that in mind.
So, what does that mean for fans of the Zelda series? As fans of Ocarina of Time and of Majora's Mask, this recapturing our childhood is a very, very common theme for us. And for a lot of fans, when you first experience the Zelda series and the way that it's sort of unique in its story, in its mythos, in the way that you play through the game and constantly solve these puzzles on a continuous adventure, it, for a lot of us, kind of hits home. we watched Nintendo over the years kind of try again and again to recapture the magic that happened with Ocarina of Time with Majora's Mask, and their attempts were sort of failing over and over again. Twilight Princess, a lot of people claimed, was almost a carbon copy of Ocarina of Time. And once we really started thinking about the fact that Nintendo themselves could not recapture the magic that they had created in those games for us, we sort of had to address the idea that maybe we were expecting too much from Nintendo. Maybe expecting them to recapture our childhoods and then force feed it back to us was just a little bit unrealistic.
Now, that's not to say that we thought we had to like lower our expectations. I would never approach another fan and say, I think you just need to accept a slightly crappier game. No one wants that. But that is, as a viewer, that was a moment in which I had realized I had to place my own expectations in reality and realize that we were never going to capture lightning in a bottle again, as Mark Hamill has said multiple times about The Last Jedi, for instance. We're never going to capture the same feeling that we had the first time. It's just, you can't really do it unless you clone yourself. But that's a different discussion. So fan fiction also teaches us about the developers of the series. Legend of Zelda pulls from another number of myths and legends from all around the world, from the east to the west, considering that it's a game made by Japanese developers, but largely emulates Western culture most of the time. The Master Sword, for instance, resembles heavily Excalibur from the Legend of King Arthur. The Ocarina of Time from Ocarina of Time also resembles the Pied Piper, who could charm rats and children, I believe, with his song. And then there are other cultural influences from Japan. Kakariko Village from Breath of the Wild takes on a very heavy Japanese theme, as well as creatures such as the Rito, the bird people, who resemble the Tengu, who are also from Japanese legends. And the purpose of this is, for one thing, all fantasy. If you just read fantasy in general, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, all fantasy is more or less tied back to mythology and legend. And in many ways is sort of like our own like modern fan fiction of things that people wrote thousands of years ago. So modern fantasy, fan fiction of mythology, and then ours, a fan fiction of fantasy. And so it made sense to kind of crawl back up the river to the original source for inspiration. We felt that would help us make a better story, was to understand where everything came from.
And in studying a lot of these things, and in studying the inspirations that the developers took in order to create this game, we also learned what some of these developers really value in the series. And ultimately, what we realized from studying what the developers value in the series is that this is unfortunately very often not in line with what a lot of the fans seem to be calling out for. A lot of the fans see some of these recurring themes and characters in these games, and they, you know, when they started in the series, for us, when we started in Ocarina of Time, we saw all of Hyrule, we saw the Kokiri Forest, we saw the Deku Tree, and, you know, the story impacted us in a way that kind of shifted the way that we went through life, right? So as we grew older, as we matured, we started thinking about some of the stories that we've seen in the Zelda series, not just in the beginning, but some of the other stories. We see Kokiri Forest pop up in other games. We see Epona present in other games. We see all of these different items and things pop up in these other games, and we start to wonder, you know, how are these connected? We kind of, as we grow up and mature, we want a more matured understanding of the Zelda universe. We're not just satisfied with, you know, oh, it's a sequel. We say, you know, well, how did it go from this to this? In this game, Hyrule Castle is here, but in this game, it's moved over here, and this culture is different, you know. And ultimately, what that led to was the creation of the Hyrule Historia in 2011. How many of you guys here own or have read the Hyrule Historia? That is awesome.
That is awesome.
That is awesome to see. So a lot of you then will know that this was released right in line with Skyward Sword, which is a fantastic Zelda game. And one of the primary functions of the Hyrule Historia, which is actually, in my experience, one of the only situations where Nintendo has done a sort of really, really obvious fan service, was the timeline that they released. And this timeline uses chronology to tie each and every one of these Zelda games together and to state, here's why this happened this way. It's because in this previous game this happened this way. It gives us a concept of cause and effect that we can use to measure the relationships from one game to the next. Now, a lot of people will use this timeline not only to guide their understanding of the series, but like we've done, to generate their own fan content, whether that be theories about the series or fan fictions. Unfortunately, though, you can't really use that timeline to generate your ideas about the next game. In 2017, Eiji Aonuma did this interview talking about Breath of the Wild, and he states essentially that he doesn't want to be tied up and chained up and forced to write a new Zelda game in any way, shape, or form just based on the way the previous Zelda games were. He views that as an obstacle, as a blocker, and he wants to avoid that at all times. He wants to leave those games in the past, which is kind of almost the exact opposite of what a lot of fans seem to want. A lot of fans want to recapture and relive those moments, whereas the developers say, no, let's just make a new game. Let's pander to a new audience. Let's grow the crowd, rather than kind of paying respects to some fans of the series the way Star Wars would. So knowing that they don't use the timeline to create their new games, that tells us that we can't use the timeline to understand their new games. And ultimately, he puts the onus of kind of placing these games in the timeline on the fans. Later on in the interview, he basically states, I want to leave it to the fans to figure out where it goes in the timeline, which essentially means that Nintendo has nullified the timeline. The timeline is fan fiction. The timeline has absolutely no merit to the canon because the developers, when writing the games, don't consider it as a piece of the canon. This creates this huge dissonance between the developers and the fans that I think it was already there, but this interview was probably the moment that it was the most highlighted for me. And I think that dissonance, that disconnect between the developers and the fans is probably the series' weakest link. Pun. You'll see that in Star Wars, nice. They do a lot of work with reintroducing some of these really home-hitting moments with having Chewie and Han Solo walk back onto the Falcon and say, we're home. But this series, the most that I think we've ever seen in this series is, small cameos that aren't really emotionally impactful in any way, or, musical cameos. Not that any of us don't appreciate the music in Zelda. So the development of this timeline effectively backfired for them, which is really unfortunate.
This quote also directly shows that while fans like myself, and I hope fans like you guys, idolize these older games and use this timeline as pretty much our reference tool to understand those older games, the developers would rather leave all this in the past and move past it as a useful tool for writing.
So ultimately, that brings us to the question of what do the fans want out of this series, right? What value do the fans want to get from this series? This kind of brings us to the point of discussing the gap between the series that there is.
So when we realized that there was this gap between Nintendo and the fans, the dissonance between the development and between fan service, essentially, we sort of knew that we were on the right track to write in that direction, to write towards trying to mend that gap. We looked at a lot of other fan stories, as I unfortunately said before. We also looked at some of the core concepts that we thought made Zelda. And these concepts, steered our writing. And one of the biggest indications between other works of fan fiction was that people were super interested in the 100-year time gap between Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess. It's like 100 and change, but you know what I mean. That gap isn't just a canonical gap. There's also a thematic gap there. Because Majora's Mask is a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, we look at that as being the two first entries in an unfinished trilogy. So now there's a thematic gap in being that there's a piece of the structure there that is missing. It's just a void of, please write me.
What's funny and kind of neat is a lot of fans have already kind of said that same thing. A lot of fans do want to explore that gap. That gap existing between those two games, and it's kind of unsurprising that they want to explore that because Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and Twilight Princess were some of the most successful titles in the series. You'll see this is a mock-up of a ROM hack that was made. Someone basically took the game of Ocarina of Time and rewrote it to be that unfinished final chapter of the trilogy. Voyager of Time takes place as Link returns to Hyrule, and what's really cool and admirable about Voyager of Time is that it was created by a fan who had no coding experience, had no any kind of digital programming experience, and for them it was just that they were so driven by this passion to tell this story that they said, I don't care if I don't know anything about this, I'm literally only going to learn this because I desperately want to tell this story. I think there's so much value to this story that, I need to tell this story. I'm going to do what it takes to tell this story. So when we realized that, all these people also wanted to tell this story, it told us, yeah, we were probably on the right track in the story that we wanted to tell.
And hats off to you guys for that. Hats off to just Zelda fans in general for stuff like this. I feel like Star Trek and Star Wars fans get all the credit for being rabid, foaming at the mouth, crazed out fans, but we're a close third, and I'm very proud. It was around ideas that our own story began to take shape. We knew that our story was going to involve an adult Link returning to Hyrule from his journey to find Navi, and that we wanted it to be big, to be final, because it was going to include a lot of themes. But we also knew that it couldn't just be a business as usual. Go to the castle, fight Ganon, blow stuff up, everyone wins. We knew that in order for this to be special, Legend of Zelda would have to do the one thing that it hadn't done for a long time and only recently started doing with Breath of the Wild, and that is evolve.
You see, in studying The Legend of Zelda, we sort of missed one of the crucial points of the story. And it is funny to tell you guys this and to admit to you guys that we somehow missed this, because it is arguably the key point of the Zelda series. And that is, the story doesn't change. From game to game to game, the story is told in an almost completely cyclical copy and paste way. And that's not just something that Zelda does, in kind of service to his fans, or that Nintendo does because the formula works. They do that because it's actually a part of the story. This Zelda cycle where, the hero is reincarnated just in time to catch, the evil guy rising to power, and then the hero guy rises to power and takes him down with the combination of wisdom and courage. This is a key component in the Zelda series. This is a wildly important aspect of the Zelda series.
So going back to my apparently unpopular opinions of Skyward Sword, one of the issues that I had with that game was that it tried too hard to explain where all of this came from. To me, there's a mysticism here. There's a mystery here. And I think by trying to begin this cycle, that Nintendo broke it in that game. So, and you can't break the cycle and still have a Zelda game that feels like an effective Zelda game. So in our own story, while our goal was never to break the cycle, we did know we had to bend the cycle just a little bit, which is kind of one of those tightrope of writing acts. So one day actually like 4 or 5 years ago now, I came across this next image here. This is a render made by an artist named Davian Canderley that was shown at Comic-Con 2010. This is Link as we have never seen him before in the Legend of Zelda series, as an old man, as a really old man.
Seeing this image of the hero of time kind of falling victim to time in the long run gave us the answers to questions that we had not yet been asking. It told us so much in such a very simple image. It kind of revealed all of this, mysticism that, like Colin was talking about, what does happen to him after Majora's Mask? I mean, does he return to Hyrule? What happens? And we saw this Link. It was almost immediate. We saw this and we thought, this is the Link that we want to see more of. This concept of Link is what we want to explore. And we knew immediately that this was how we were going to tell our story in a way that evolved the canon while still staying true to its roots, while paying respect to all of the fans and kind of like letting the series grow up with the fans and then completing that trilogy. This was the Link that we were going to use for Hero of Time.
This honestly, so this idea kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. If you can imagine, I was in our smelly apartment. I was just yelling at Jaren all day about this idea. It was compelling to me, and it was compelling because it was a marriage between interesting like fun action adventure game, but also compelling spiritual journey for the player. I believe at one point the compelling theme expansion that I wanted was that as the hero of time, he wouldn't just be the hero who uses time to save the day, but now he is the hero who has conquered it, which was just a really powerful idea to me. And ultimately, what we began writing was a love letter to Legend of Zelda.
This vision of Old Man Link is meant to be a direct metaphorical connection to a lot of the fans of the series who have grown up over the years with the series. We know that a lot of the series, a lot of the fans of it, we look back at Ocarina and we think, God, has it really been 20 years? Has it been that long? The polygons seemed so much less obvious back then. I don't know if my eyes have gotten better or not. And so that metaphorical connection, that growing up Link with the player, provides this new connection to Link that is really, really important in the series that kind of gets lost over time. This is a YouTube comment that we pulled off of the original soundtrack for Ocarina of Time, and we kind of saw that this fan echoes a lot of the sentiments that a lot of fans write. It's a little long-winded, but shortening it is this guy basically explaining that he was so deeply connected to Ocarina of Time as a kid that the moment that he felt that connection break, his childhood felt like it was that was the moment that his childhood was officially over. It was kind of this realization that drove us, right? You can never go back to that moment. You can never recapture that lightning in a bottle. All you can do is move forward with the series and try to do it in a way that doesn't necessarily recapture that lightning in a bottle, but maybe something else. I can't believe we didn't write a bottle joke. That is amazing to me. What a missed opportunity.
I'm leaving. So I'm looking at my notes, and something that I should have mentioned earlier was that as far as the age range of Zelda characters, something that I forgot to mention was that one of the initial challenges that we were running into is that because of the different ages of Zelda fans, the Zelda fan base has a massive age range, larger than most other series. And that means that there are multiple kinds of Zelda fans out there, but they pretty much all sound like this. And again, please don't feel shamed because this is just me and Jaren. This is us, colorized, 1942. But growing up personally, because I am an adult, I like to tell myself that. Growing up personally has made Legend of Zelda less relatable to me, and that's really sad. Look around the room, for instance. We're not actually looking around the room. Look at each other. Disrespectful. Some of us are getting up there in age. Not trying to point anyone out, but so playing Breath of the Wild, for instance, loved Breath of the Wild. Please don't hate me. That's not criticism.
I hate you anyway.
Oh, cool, thanks. But playing Breath of the Wild as a 17-year-old kid who's 5'2" and like maybe 100 pounds soaking wet, climbing mountains, killing monsters, and never getting an ounce of muscle, that was weird to me. It was really weird to me, and a little unrelatable because I knew that image of Link was meant to play towards a younger crowd, and that was a younger crowd that I could simply no longer identify with. Link has always been a child in every Zelda game. Even the games in which we have a colloquial adult Link, in Ocarina of Time, he's 14. In Breath of the Wild, he's 17. He's never truly an adult in these games. And that's an intentional choice on the part of the developers. But looking around this room at pretty much all of you, we are not children anymore.
I'm a child.
Most of us are not children anymore. I'm also a child, I'm sorry.
You write fan fiction, we're all children.
And that, so playing Breath of the Wild like that, that created a disconnection that I never expected to feel, and I was heartbroken. So at first, the idea that was meant to simply fill a canonical gap became a teaching moment. And writing Hero of Time taught me several important things. And just to kind of go back over what we've been over, writing Hero of Time taught me about the fans, that we really do care about the established world and theme of Zelda, and that things like that, this timeline, this is where we live. It taught me about the developers who don't live with that timeline, who care more about gameplay and memorable gameplay experiences, which is an admirable goal. But they do so even at the cost of the story and the quality of that story. And lastly, it taught me about the source fiction itself, which is that Legend of Zelda is not perfect, which is really hard to say on stage in front of like what I'm pretty sure is 100 people. But Legend of Zelda is not perfect. So for me, and I'm hoping for Jaren too, this Hero of Time project has been a chance for Legend of Zelda it's been a chance to be better as fans, and to be better as a series. A chance to not only fill a canonical gap, but to also fill a gap in the player experience with Link. And that gap in our experience with Link is that we never got the chance to grow up with Link. And a good example of why this is important, think of the new Star Wars movies. We talk about Star Wars way too much. This is a problem. Read our articles, and like every article has a Star Wars reference. I'm disgusted. But in not The Last Jedi, The Force Awakens, we talked about Han and Chewie walking onto the Millennium Falcon, what we call the "we're home" moment. And that is basically the moment that moment wasn't just for those characters. For those of you who like Star Wars, you're in here, right? For those of you who like Star Wars, that moment was for you. That moment was the pain and anguish and the waiting time and the joy of a generation of Star Wars fans. In 2 words. So why can't Legend of Zelda grow up with us? Why can't it be about growing up? Not just like, and not like dark growing up. We're not gonna go like Christopher Nolan, Dark Knight, like, where's the princess? Why so serious, Link? But don't tempt me.
Who here imagined Tingle as the Joker? Show of hands. Great, me too.
So when I get home, I have some new fan fiction to write. So for us, this is what we've been trying to write, and what we may not accomplish, but hopefully we'll accomplish, is writing a story that it's about Link, it's about Zelda, it's about the series as a whole, and it's about us, the fans who grew up with Legend of Zelda.
That, for us and for you guys, is where Hero of Time begins. It's a new story, and it's written by fans, and it's written with the collective fan base in mind, trying to not recapture the lightning in a bottle that is impossible to do, but to take the series in a direction that answers a lot of our questions and that speaks volumes to where we are in our lives. That is where Hero of Time begins, and for us, that's where our presentation at PAX East ends. I'm thanking you guys so much for dealing with all these jokes. I know they were very bad. I'm gonna go ahead and pass the mic off to Aaron, and we can shoot through some Q&A. So thank you guys very much for listening to us.
PAX, thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed that. Before we transition to Q&A, I need to plug, we are here again today and then tomorrow. If you liked what you heard, we're talking about 2 entirely different topics at 2 more panels. So if you want to think about the great books of video games, what it means to build a video game canon and what games belong in that canon, we're going to be doing all that at 5:30 p.m. today in Bumblebee. Be there. It's going to be a lot of fun. Tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. also in Bumblebee, we're going to be thinking about all of the many ways that video games have been innovating episodic storytelling and thinking about things like, does DLC actually matter to the storytelling of video games? What effect does mythos have on video games? Things like this. So if you're interested, please come to those. If you want to head out before Q&A, that's okay. This is the time. And before we jump into Q&A, I think we're gonna do a little selfie with the crowd because we want to integrate all of the fans into our own storytelling, as we've been talking at you about for the last 45 minutes or so.
You make it sound like such a bad thing.
You guys rock. Thank you. What a way to start PAX on a Thursday. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so if you want to chat with us, we have about 10 minutes I've got left in the room, so we're going to start it here. If you want to keep the conversation going, we're all about that. So once our time runs out here, we're just going to go outside. Feel free to follow us. We'll be hanging out and talking. We've got that talkback mic there, so if you want to chat, jump in. Anything about Zelda, fan fiction, other things related to video games. There, yeah.
So there was one thing that I wanted to bring up. I did come kind of late, so if this was addressed earlier, my bad completely. But when you were doing the whole cycle of reincarnation thing, where it sort of started with Link being reincarnated and the evil developing, there is another common thread, which is usually the Master Sword, which always appears in every story. So I was wondering if you put special thought into that as well as a part of that cycle, and how adult Link, who would probably have the Master Sword, how he would deal with passing it on to the next generation or making it ready.
We did, and that's sort of one of the sensitive details of the plot. However, a big part of what I was thinking about when I sort of wrote that section of the story was there was a lot of setup to do for the next game, which was Twilight Princess.
Right.
A lot of what I was thinking about was how to connect Ocarina of Time to Twilight Princess, and then still see how much room I had in between. But yeah, I'm trying to think how much I can get away with here.
It's delicate.
It's delicate. I think the thing that I wanted to play with was kind of looking at the relationship between Link and the Master Sword a little bit differently, which is a little closer to a little like how Breath of the Wild did it, but with a twist. And that was Breath of the Wild makes you wait a really long time before you get the Master Sword, because it took me forever to get those 13 hearts worth of those stupid shrines. And it's got this great whole, like, you go back to the Core Oak Forest, there's some nostalgia, there's the Deku Tree. It's a great callback to older games, but the one thing that I think the game was missing was that there should have, for an older Link who has already wielded the Master Sword, there should be a personal relationship between him and this more or less inanimate object, kind of because it's symbolic to him of, days gone by, but also to, essentially his greater destiny. So yes, the short answer is yes.
Another thing that we kind of used in approaching that was when we wrote this, right, the primary things that we were looking at were facts in the game within the canon. So we know for a fact where the Master Sword is at the end of Ocarina of Time, and we know for a fact where it is in Twilight Princess. So all we really did was try and figure out a way to connect those things in a way that makes sense while still telling what we felt was an authentic story. Which kind of begs the question, and I'm sure this answer is different for everyone, can you tell a Zelda story without the Master Sword and make it really good? I won't tell you whether or not that's our story, but I will tell you that this is something that we thought a lot about.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Okay. You talked about the Zelda timeline and how Nintendo has officially said we don't really look at that for new games. So, in that it's basically now fan fiction. Where do you place Breath of the Wild in that, in your opinion?
So I'm kind of two opinions about this. My first opinion is that I was sort of personally outraged the idea that Nintendo doesn't consider the timeline when they build games. They just build games and then they hope that us as fans that we'll do the heavy lifting as far as lore and canon for them. And as much as I love Nintendo, personally, that's not a great move. That's in my opinion. So my first answer would be that I don't know and don't care. But my second opinion as a Zelda fan who can't help himself is that I would honestly go back up to Skyward Sword and then draw lines sideways. And Breath of the Wild is over here. And the reason I would do that is because of Breath of the Wild. Mostly it's the religion aspect of Breath of the Wild. You know, how they switch over to the goddess Hylia, and they never mentioned the three the golden goddesses from what we know, A Link to the Past, and then Ocarina of Time. I know what I'm talking about. So that's a big indicator that there's a huge religious shift there. And I think it's one of those things where they don't acknowledge it at all in later sections of the timeline, because as you go throughout the timeline, the games get older, especially on the Heroes Fallen timeline. That's where all like the Nintendo Entertainment System games belong, is the Heroes Fallen timeline. No mention of the goddess Hylia. So again, to me, I think that it represents a completely different timeline, where That's a timer. And I say that because I also think that Nintendo will continue to develop games with this same trend continuing in that direction unintentionally.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Afternoon.
What's up, man?
So you've mentioned the gap between Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess as where your fan fiction has been focusing. And you said you've read a number of fan fictions. Now, I'm sure that they're all over the place, but there seem to be any sort of clusters of time frames or subject matters or between games or gaps that are really popular as fan fictions?
Yeah, so one thing that we see a lot of, and this is kind of funny to say, we see a lot of people kind of looking at some of the religious aspects and trying to answer some of the questions like, where did it begin, where did it start? That's what a lot of the simpler ROM hacks that I've seen are, and most of these games are ROM hacks, a lot of them of the 2D Zelda games. Where we found a lot of them was the Zelda Wiki actually has a list of some of the most popular fan fiction, right? There's an entire section that's dedicated primarily to games orbiting Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and Twilight Princess. It's probably because the hardware for those is the most accessible to build for. The engines that you would use to build on those systems are relatively simple compared to, for example, some of the newer engines and hardwares, getting a game to run on the Switch, for example, or trying to write a game for the Nintendo Entertainment System, which I don't know if anyone here has ever done that, but that is a nightmare to do if you want to do it authentically to the way it was originally done. Yeah, go ahead.
I think something else that's interesting about that gap, we should probably move on after this so we can get to the last question, but one of the reasons beyond hardware that might invite a lot of fan fiction there is, you guys didn't mention it, but one of the things you first said when you brought this series to me, it was, you have these two episodes in the Hero of Time's life, in Ocarina of Time and in Majora's Mask, and then this thing happens in Twilight Princess where he appears as the hero's shade, and even if people weren't thinking that initially, Nintendo said as much in the Hyrule Historia. Yes, the Hero of Time is the hero's shade, but there's this weird dissonance between the Hero of Time's, wow, all right, that's just what he is. Hero of Shade's existence in Twilight Princess on the one hand, but then also the fact that because you're not playing as him, whereas you played as the Hero of Time in Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, it doesn't feel like a conclusion to that trilogy. And I think that speaks to a broader idea that if you're trying to really flesh out a trilogy in a series like Legend of Zelda, you have to sort of center it on the same character as the Avatar, right? There's a sense, I think, that you guys feel and that I do too, that Nintendo kind of skipped right from the third entry in that trilogy to the epilogue in Twilight Princess, which I think is what invites a lot of fans to say, well, we need that third game in the trilogy. Thank you. And after this, I think we're gonna have to wrap up, but like I said, we'll be outside if you want to chat us up more.
All right. Hi. You were talking. What? You were talking about how you might like to see a older Link in some of the future Zelda games, and there has been a lot of younger Links, like 17, 13, whatever. But How do you think fans would react to that? Because I personally feel like it would take away from sort of the childish feel of playing Legend of Zelda.
So that is something that I ran into with this guy when I first proposed the idea, and I think it would be an extremely polarizing idea. No one idea is for everybody, is pretty much the takeaway there. How I think fans would react in the event that, let's say, tomorrow Nintendo announced an Old Man Link game.
You guys remember Wind Waker?
Pretty much. I think if they announced it tomorrow, there'd be a lot of doubt, and a lot of anger, and a lot of fear, and a lot of dark side stuff, including for me. I think it's like I'm the person writing this, and I know that it's a dangerous idea because it's super easy to screw up. So, yeah, I get your doubts on the issue.
Yeah, I mean, I was just more wondering what you think from your perspective, being one that knows all the fan fiction and stuff.
All right, gang, we should wrap up here because it's time. But like I said, thank you so much for coming. We got 2 more panels. If you're interested, check us out and hang out afterwards if you want to talk more. We love talking about video games.